So thanks for your time. How did you learn about that assassination attempt, and what was your immediate reaction when you heard about it?
Yeah, Riz, I learned about it when I landed at O'Hare International Airport here in Chicago yesterday. I flew in from London to go up to the convention in Milwaukee this week. So right around when I landed is when it happened. So my phone, as soon as I turned it on the tarmac, my phone just started lighting up. My wife gave me a call. So like everybody, I was quite shocked, but I was really worried because I didn't, unless you were in front of a television, you didn't really know what was going on. So maybe 10 minutes later, I found out that, he had been injured, but not critically, and obviously was not assassinated. So still, quite shocked, a bit relieved after hearing that he escaped it. But, and I think today there's going to be a lot of, I don't think this goes away. This is not a one-time event that, people forget about in 3 days. I think this is a historical moment.
And in fact, that's what I was going to ask you. As chairman of Republicans Overseas, I'm wondering, what are the most pressing questions you have at this time?
Well, I think the first one is what happened. How did the Secret Service fall down and not notice that this gunman was climbing up the building and getting onto the rooftop. I mean, I haven't seen footage of it, but it's I think there definitely seems like there were some kinks in the armor with the Secret Service. That's not to suggest that they didn't show their outright bravery and professionalism when it happened. The people that were directly protecting the president did exactly what they're trained to do. And so did the brave people that took out the gunman quickly. And so, I do think there were probably some mistakes made, but it's too early to try to speculate. I think, we have to give that time. But the second thing is, the next question is, will this encourage the real radical progressive left to dial it down a bit? It's one thing to be critical, and I'm totally fine with that. Let's have the argument. If you don't agree with his policies, or some of his decisions, that's fine to criticize. But, calling him a dictator, calling him this great threat to democracy. There was a Twitter that went out a few weeks ago from Biden that said, dictator on day one, he must be stopped. Well, that's not suggesting that Joe Biden caused this, but I think that rhetoric can really trigger people who are already psychologically unstable or mentally unstable, to do something like that. So I just hope it dials down, and on both sides, Riz. I mean, I'm not claiming that the fringe right isn't just as off the wall as the fringe left, but I would hope that the rhetoric coming from the leaders, forget about the fringy parts of the party. They're never going to go away. I'm talking about leadership and some of the rhetoric from political leaders on the left that's just been really hateful.
You're right, sir, of course, at a time when the country is so divided as well in the lead up to the election. Now, I wonder, how do you think this particular event will frame the next few days at the Republican convention in Milwaukee, where Republicans are due to officially approve Donald Trump as their presidential candidate?
Yeah. Well, I mean, two things, Riz. First of all, he will be welcomed, heroically on Thursday. I think it's elevated him. It's, the way he demonstrated his strength, his ability to keep cool, his reassurance of the crowd or to the crowd. And I think the crowd, reacted to that really well and in a very positive way, not in a violent or, sort of fight back way. He refused to stay in the hospital. He was there for an hour. I just think it's a moment where he's really demonstrated strength. And that's in contrast to President Biden, who, like it or not, has demonstrated, kind of a cognitive challenges as well as physical weakness. So that was an interesting angle, and I think we'll see that on Thursday. And the second thing is it probably puts a lot more attention on the convention. I'm heading up there in a few hours. This thing really wasn't getting paid attention to by the media because so much of the attention's been going to President Biden, his debate debacle with Trump, his ABC interview, his missteps at the G7. Basically the conversation around his cognitive abilities. So in one way, it might help get the attention away from Biden's problems, but also it will give an opportunity for the GOP to get some attention and get some focus on the convention, which was sort of flying under the radar. And not only because of Biden capturing so much media attention with his challenges, but also I think the Democrat convention is the one that everyone has their eyes on. Because people are speculating that it will be a convention where they actually broker a new candidate. And secondly, here in Chicago, we can assume there's going to be massive protests and start to look maybe like 1968. Whereas the Republican convention is kind of boring. I know there'll be protests, but I don't think they'll be nearly as incredible and as massive as they will be in Chicago. And secondly, Milwaukee's kind of a sleepy town, as you know. So I think the focus was more on the DNC, not the RNC. Right. But this incident yesterday will change that.
Now, of course, the campaigning gets a lot more heated as we get closer to the election, and the campaign ads get a lot stronger as well. And there were reports that both Republicans and Democrats were pulling campaign ads from TV following the attack on Donald Trump. So I'm wondering what your take on that is and what impact that might have.
Yeah, I think it's quite natural. You surely don't want to be doing any negative advertising and, being too critical of your opponent at a time like this. And I think, the comments from the left, from the leadership on the left, whether it was President Biden, former presidents Obama, Clinton, everybody, sort of put aside their partisan differences and sent and said really nice things. That's important. So, that how long that will stay dialed down, I don't know. But surely for a few days they'll maybe pull back. I'm sure they're going to pull a lot of the ads they were planning on running, especially in the swing states that were a little bit aggressive with the rhetoric. Again, calling him a dictator and the end of democracy and comparing him to Hitler. And I think that's going away. And if we get back to the issues and the decision making of these two presidents, Trump wins on the merit. And I think the iconic photo from yesterday with the 3 Secret Service men around him with blood on his face and a great American flag behind it, that is a winner. I would just run that all the time.
In spite of the rivalry, and I know you mentioned your concerns with President Biden, but how do you regard President Biden's public response to the news and the fact he did call Donald Trump directly after the incident?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, good for him. And I commended him for that. First of all, he referred to him as Donald, and that's a rarity. Maybe it's never happened. He always calls him by his last name. Rarely refers to him as President Trump. He just, but I thought his comments were welcome, but also the fact that, I don't know if this made the global media, Riz, but he actually left his beach house in Delaware and returned to Washington to the White House. I thought that was a class move. I thought, given the instability that can come from these things, a near miss like that, I think it was important for him to be back in Washington. And he loves his beach house. He loves going to Camp David, but especially the Delaware beach house. And so, good for him for going back to Washington and sort of, showing some leadership there.
I guess it's a wake-up call for anyone in leadership roles or campaigning like that too. Now, the shooter was a young man from Pennsylvania who was reportedly registered as a Republican. What do you make of that?
Well, I don't necessarily buy that. I mean, a lot of people, he's young, maybe he changed his mind and became a radicalized leftist, but I think more likely he might have registered as a Republican because you can vote in the Republican primaries if you're, and so if you're a rabid anti-Trumper, and we saw this in many states in the nomination process where either voters are allowed to cross over in some states, and others, they just register in the party if they're not allowed to cross over. So a lot of people have been doing that were rabid anti-Trump people. So that doesn't surprise me at all. But he did donate to a PAC, a super PAC called Think Blue or Work Blue, something like that. I mean, definitely a progressive activist organization. But again, it's day one. I think it's too early to speculate on motivations. Given that he was 20 or 21 years old, it was probably a lone wolf situation. I don't imagine that, this was some organization backed by Soros or whatever, whatever the speculators are saying right now. So I think we have to be patient and just wait and see what happens.
Well, as you know, Mr. Swenson, Americans have unfortunately witnessed several attacks on the lives of presidential candidates, including Kennedy and Ronald Reagan in 1981. And at that time, Ronald Reagan was polling badly, but he received a major boost following the attack. Now, I'm wondering, well, you've mentioned that this really has put Donald Trump in a kind of very positive light among his supporters because of that kind of bravado and that picture. But I wonder what it'll do for his numbers in the coming days and weeks.
I think it will help. I'm not suggesting it'll be 20 points. You know, President Trump does have a limit. He's been capped at 47. I think this might be an opportunity for him to go over 47 for the first time in terms of approval ratings. You know, just because, you know, there'll be some sympathy for him. I think people appreciate the way he behaved after he was shot. So and you're right, Riz. You know, Reagan had a really big bump because of the assassination. He gave it all back in 6 months. By 1982, he was polling in the 30s because it took 2 years for his economic policies to really work and trickle into the system. And so, you know, 2 years after that, he won one of the greatest landslides in American history, winning all but one state in 1984. So, but you know, he did get that bump. I think, you know, Trump will get a bump. The betting odds went up significantly yesterday, went up 18 points, I'm told, immediately after the shooting. So I think, you know, he'll get a big bump in the near term. He'll give some of that back, but I think he was going to win anyway. Prior to the rally yesterday, prior to the shooting, he was up 5 points in Pennsylvania. That's a bigger gap that he's ever enjoyed. He was always polling behind Biden in 2020 in those swing states. He polled behind Mrs. Clinton in Pennsylvania back in 2016. So I think he's on the way anyway, but this incident yesterday will help. The question is how much.
Well, it's interesting. You referred to that image of Donald Trump with his bloodied face and his fist defiantly clenched. It seems to be one of the iconic images of the age. And I'm expecting we're going to see that on T-shirts and in campaign ads and shared on social media.
Yeah.
It's one of those images, I guess, that goes across the world. How do you think the global audience will regard the way that President Trump has handled himself?
Well, you know, I think their first impulse will be, you know, isn't it a shame that there was an assassination attempt, and it just doesn't, you know, look good for the image of America, nor did it in 1981 or 1968 or 63. But you have a lot of these problems around the world. You know, there are two British MPs have died in the last few years at the hands of you know, sort of extremist violence. And so I think the global audience, the global media will understand that this is endemic of what's going on in the world. And I hope it ends soon. And if this is what it takes to dial down the sort of hateful rhetoric, the Trump derangement syndrome or derangement syndrome about anybody should be dialed down.
Do you fear that politics could become more violent? We speak to analysts who worry that is the case. Or do you think this could actually be a watershed that allows both sides to step back and kind of check their political passions?
Yeah, no, I think it's the latter. I mean, look, I'm nervous about Chicago. I mentioned that earlier in the segment here. You know, I'm nervous about political violence in Chicago. We saw it on the university campuses over the last few months. And these organizations, these places backed by Soros, the Rockefeller brothers, the Ford Foundation, they are proposing violence. You know, they are saying they have handbooks on agitation, and they want to be arrested. They want to get into conflict with the police. So, you know, I'm worried about that. This city is going to be under some stress. And by the way, we're in a city that has embraced so-called bail reform and defund the police. You have a radically progressive mayor who will be much more prone to defend the rioters like they did in 2020 when they defended Antifa and Black Lives Matter, who were vandalizing and killing and tearing down monuments in this beautiful city. So I hope that doesn't happen again in August, but I'm afraid it will. But this event might help dial down the rhetoric. I don't know that it will eliminate political violence, but hopefully it's the start of a better conversation.
I should point out we don't have the other side to kind of address the allegations and claims you make about their views and attitudes. But I would say that history is often shaped by chance, changing fortunes, and a series of near misses. So when you think about how different the outcome of the assassination attempt could have been, the difference between just a few millimeters with Donald Trump turning his head a fraction of a second later, perhaps, how important do you think a milestone this will become?
It's amazing. Look, I'm so glad it wasn't successful, this assassination attempt, because I think that there would have been some absolutely radical behavior from many people on the right. I'm not suggesting that the left has a lock on misbehavior. I think they do more of it. I think that they did a lot more damage in the summer of 2020 than we've seen from anything on the right, in spite of January 6th. So, I can make that argument credibly just using data and using numbers, but I'm glad that it didn't turn out to be an excuse for any radical behavior. And look at how those people handled themselves in that rally yesterday. Again, he wanted to reassure them. There was no panic. There was no, yelling. And I mean, of course, there was the initial, that first moment where your natural instinct is to duck. But you saw people helping the victims, the other victims. You saw people helping the Secret Service by pointing out the shooter, the gunman on the roof. As he was going up there. So look, I think this could end up being a good moment for the country, not just for President Trump.
Well, Greg Swenson, it's a real pleasure to speak with you. We'll be keeping an eye on things, of course. Yeah, let's talk again. Thank you, sir.